Okay, welcome to this meeting. Um, I'm Andrew Boswell. I'm going to introduce the Norwich Western Link Road and give a brief history of that, and then the context in the local plan and ongoing council, DfT, and planning processes. So that just says that. So I thought the best place to start would be on the Greater Norwich local plan itself, partly because that is actually out to consultation at the moment, and largely um, it really sort of defines the crux of the problem actually with the road, um, which is to a certain extent sort of shown by these little sort of pictures the councils have put on the cover of the plan, that you've got environment balanced against homes, infrastructure, delivery, economy, and you've got communities thrown in there as well. But that's basically the essence of the problem that we know with this government, but also the county council, that basically economic growth and delivery of homes and infrastructure and jobs is driving everything, and that
Yeah.
includes the Norwich Western Link. So the plan runs from 2018 to 2038, and this is they always have a key diagram in these plans, and this is the one in the plan out for consultation. So it shows the whole GNLP area in that shading. It shows a number of things. For example, the key things of interest are the strategic housing growth, these orange bubbles, and the purple bubbles, the key employment centres, so that's jobs. In the last plan, the joint core strategy, we um, we had this northeast growth triangle identified, and there's still further growth planned there actually, but that basically predicated the NDR going around there. I don't know if you can see, I've got this pointer on the screen. I hope you're seeing that clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Um, so what you've got down in this western corridor is you've got that's the Longwater site, which is already developed, but further development planned there in jobs. Um, and then you've got the food hub there. Now, one thing to point out about this plan is that the they talk a lot about the Cambridge Norwich Tech Corridor, and you'd think that would be largely just the A11
Yeah.
and Wyndham, Heatherset, and so on. But actually, if you look at the shading of the strategic growth area, it actually covers all of this area, and the Norwich Western Link is basically shown as a sort of bound of that strategic growth area. So the Cambridge Norwich Tech Corridor isn't just A11, it actually includes A47 and all this area. And so there you get to see another reason why the Norwich Western Link may be coming forward.
Yeah.
So that is the Norwich Western Link there. But there's a further factor actually, that there's been talk of this new town at Honingham. So I've put that on the map now.
Yeah.
It's not actually in the local plan, but it's mentioned as an option for the future. And we suspect that there's going to be, a growing lobby to have that there,
Yeah.
particularly as the landowner, huge amounts of money is selling land there for 7,500 houses eventually is planned there, right next to this food hub. So you've got both housing and industrial sites growing up around the A47 there. It's also just as a slightly jocular moment to point out these green lines here, these are green infrastructure corridors, and interestingly enough, the green infrastructure corridor stops exactly on the Norwich Western Link. I'm not sure they quite intended that. But the other thing, sort of more substantive about that, is the Wentham itself is a green lung into the city, but that green infrastructure corridor isn't shown on the map, which I think is a big omission. So I want to talk a bit about the Norwich transport policy. Given the sort of strategic planning policy it sits within, there's actually been plans for an outer ring road around Norwich since 1945. If you look at the city 1945 plan, you have basically this outer motorway, a sort of M25 type motorway in there. And when they got the NDR, that was sort of basically part of it. But during the sort of 90s and so on, I'm going to just stop a moment and try to mute everybody if I can. If can you sort of mute yourselves actually, because I think we're getting quite a bit of background noise.
Somebody's washing up.
Yeah, it sounds like that. On the share screen, I've lost the sort of way of doing that. But if you could mute yourselves, that's better. It's gone. So in the 90s, the NDR sort of went out of favour, but it emerged again in the early 2000s. And initially they were talking of sort of, going all the way through to the A47. But in 2005, the county council decided to promote just a 3/4 NDR. And the reason was that it was too difficult to cross the Wensum. The legal advice given by the council monitoring officer was that they wouldn't be able to overcome the environmental issues of crossing the special area of conservation, which the River Wensum is. So they decided on this 3/4 route, which is what was built a few years back and opened in 2018. Interestingly, the DfT didn't actually see a strategic need to go beyond the airport, and they only funded it as far from Posick to the Norwich airport. And the rest of that NDR bit was built basically on the council's own money, or of course that is our money as council taxpayers. I now want to sort of zoom in and look at the different route options which have come forward over the years. I'm going to zoom into that area of the map. And basically you had route options sort of came forward in 2014 and 2016. They're two big reports. But essentially what I want to point out here, you have a number of routes more or less going north-south in orientation. So you've got these purple routes, two purple routes and a brown one, which I actually think should be purple free, but they called it brown. And then this red route, and then these orange blue ones. And actually there's a green route here, which actually links up directly from the airport. But that one's sort of no longer in this options. What just for context for later, I want to zoom in on this part of the map and show that. So that's that, and that red route you'll notice there is sort of going through and it's skirting around underneath this ancient woodland. That's slightly different to the route which is chosen now, as we'll see, but it's largely that area. That's actually a big open field which if you go up there you'll see, and they had it going through there at that time. But this area here, this woodland, is Rose Carn. Let's put that on the map because that's Ian's woodland and he'll be talking about that later. Back to these routes in 2014, 2016, I sort of talk about the environmental issues at a sort of high level, that this route was identified as having very major environmental problems, the red route, because of crossing the Wensum there. And the purple and brown routes, purple one and brown route, were also identified as having environmental issues, but I think more to do with going through this woodland here. And this purple 2 route was identified as having the least environmental issues. Also not having environmental issues at this end because the road had already crossed the Wensum, so you didn't have to construct further bridges or whatever across the Wensum if you went off there at Moreton. And this all got caught in this sifting matrix thing in 2014. And it's very clear here, where I put those two arrows, that that purple route 2 was environmentally the best route. But what we'll see on the next slide, what the council actually went for was the worst of this red one, which is crossing the Wensum Sack. So it's the furthest east route, which has all these red bars filled in on the environment, compared to this one. And you look at these other sifting things, we perhaps could get into that later, why they may have chosen this route, but largely it's to do with it's to do with the economic growth, as we've said at the beginning. So this is what actually came as options in a consultation before July 2019, and then when they chose the route in 2019. And the route they chose was Route C, this one. So it's that one. So what you've got there is you've got the worst bit of the red one, the previous red one, crossing the Wensum there. And you've got the worst bit of the purple one route, which was hitting woodland there, if you remember, all in this Route C. The other odd thing about it is this orientation. One of the arguments they use about the road is that it's going to remove congestion, particularly from Western Longville and the other villages, and particularly this road going down through here. But you could see from here that anyone who is making the journey from the Fakenham Road to employment sites like the university and the research park have to do this zigzag. It's literally going around two sides around the triangle. Can you mute your mic, whoever else is talking, please? You have to go round two sides around the triangle twice for that route into that western part of Norwich. And it doesn't really make sense until you start to think about all these development options down here for Honningham, for the new town, and the jobs here. And then, of course, you've got this route up here to the airport. So that's showing how it massively favours the traffic going in that direction. And the congestion, not just the villagers in Western Longville would like it, the congestion's not actually going to be removed as much as they've been told by the county council. So just going back onto those again, I just overlay those routes just so you can really see how it changed. And that Route C, which gets the worst of the old route, the old red route and the purple one. So now I want to move on to important process dates coming up and a bit in the past. Starting from July 2019. And in July 2019, that's when that option C was basically decided by the county council. They said, that's our preferred option. We're going to work with that, and we're going to put in this strategic outline business case to the government for £130 million of funding. And they also published various dates, which I've put on this slide and next one in this column here. So, hello?
Can I ask Victoria? I think it's Victoria, if you can mute.
I've got mute on. I don't understand because it says it's muted.
You come up when we hear the noise, sorry.
Okay, well.
It's definitely not muted.
Right.
Okay, she is now.
Okay. I can't see because I'm sharing my screen, but thanks for helping out there.
Andrew, this is Richard. Could you ask the person to put something over the microphone if they can't mute it?
Victoria, could you try that or try to
She is now muted, so
Great.
let's just move on.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's
I think
Anne
it's
here. I
Jen.
think Jen P also needs to mute.
Jen, can you
Okay.
mute?
Okay, the background noise isn't too bad anyway, so I'll continue. So those are the dates at July 2019 they're predicting. In May 2020, they got a response from the government, and the government gave them conditional approval for that 130 million pounds road, 130 million pounds funding for the road. But the government also said that further evidence was required to address the environmental impacts and how these are to be mitigated. So the government clearly sort of heard that there were issues, environmental issues, and they hadn't sort of overcome them. And it's going to be very interesting to see, now we're going for this outline business case, whether the government think that they have been adequately addressed. Now, the outline business case was meant to be in January 2020. 15 months later, it's coming to the cabinet on the March of 8th. And those are, of course, very important dates coming up. Talk about those later, what we can do before that. And you've got the design and build contract coming to that March the 8th cabinet meeting. Now, that is actually them deciding to appoint the contractor. So at the moment, they're going through a bidding process, and they will have reduced it to something like 3 candidate contractors, and then they will be assessing those and going for a preferred contractor on March the 8th. So we might find a bit more about the contract side. We probably won't find anything more about it, actually. And, that's one of the things where we need more information, because the contract can throw up issues. So when might we get that OBC approval from the DfT? I suspect it will be around later this summer. And then the dates go on. They need to do a formal pre-application public consultation. And by the way, the public consultations which have happened so far aren't really formal, and they have no statutory weight in any planning inquiry. But this formal one does. And it was originally targeted for this month, February 2021. I think it will now be July and August 2021, which they love doing, actually. They're putting it through the 2 summer months, which is what they did on the NDR one many years ago, 2013, I think. But anyway, we expect it in July or August. And then we could expect the planning application, once they've sifted through that consultation, to be published in September, October. Then there comes the planning process. Now, that could be as long as 18 months. And on the next slide, I'm going to sort of describe the various options for that. But if it is that 18-month process, I think they won't have got planning till sort of early 20. Actually, I've just realised that should be 23, I think, because an 18-month process from there gets you into early July 23, and then everything that so that's right. Yeah, the actual one is early 23. That's right. So there will have been a 9-month delay from what they were predicting there, if it takes 18 months, and then the construction might be around about 2023. This full business case is another business case, but actually it's less important than this outline business case. It tends to actually be just a sign off for that 130 million pounds. So they will have got the planning by July 2022, and then they'll send the full business case in, and it's more or less just signed off by DfT at that point, as long as they've met all the other conditions. And then that would go on to the road opening in 2026. So I said there was 2 choices of the planning process, and this is quite important, actually, both in the time scale, but also the substance of the planning process. The Town and Country Planning Act process, that is basically the road going to the local planning authority, which would be Broadland in this case. And basically, it's relatively quick. It's much less demanding because it's just like any other planning application going to a planning committee. It's less powerful for the council because it doesn't give direct access to things like compulsory purchase and highways powers. You're doing the side roads and things like that. It is, of course, subject to planning inquiry call-in on section 77 of the TCPA, and that's very likely to happen anyway on a scheme this big. And it may well be actually that the council themselves ask the SOS Secretary of State to call it in. They did that, for example, on the Norfolk incinerator. They held the planning meeting, and this afternoon of the planning meeting wrote to the SOS and they consented it, but please call it in to force a planning inquiry. And I expect that to happen, but the planning inquiry would be shorter and less demanding than the one on the other planning process route, this nationally significant infrastructure, or NSIP. And that is under the Planning Act 2008. And basically the consent is given by a much more powerful order. It actually goes on the UK statute. It becomes a law, a development consent order. There's a much longer lead in to the planning for that because it's a much more substantive process. It's more expensive. There's a 6-month planning inquiry, and probably cost the council £500,000 to run that. It does give the council compulsory purchase powers and other legal firepower later on to sort of get things done. There's a sort of mandatory 6-month planning process. It's actually laid out how it's all done. Exactly 6 months. The whole process likely to take 18 months. Now, an interesting issue with that one is that we've got the Transport Action Network legal case going forward on the roads national planning policy statement, on whether it is assessing carbon properly and whether it's Paris compliant. And that's going to the High Court very soon. That's a very similar legal case to the Heathrow one. It's also similar to other legal cases like the Drax one, which said various things about the NPS for energy, and also one by the Good Law Project, which is challenging national policy statements, all of them challenging on carbon and Paris compliance. So it may be by the time we get to the planning inquiry that we have something to help us on the carbon. That was the thing we didn't have in the NDR inquiry, that they actually put this national policy statement, which is very weak on carbon, through just before the planning inspector wrote up the NDR one. One last thing to say about the NSIP route is there's no appeal. That's effectively because the appeal is the planning inquiry itself. So the DCO then just becomes statute, though of course you can have legal challenges to it and so on. So just a couple of comments on that planning process. The NDR has switched into the NSIP process at the very last minute. And I think that they'll do the same on the Norwich Western Link. I think they'll do that partly because of the additional powers it gives them. And we're also seeing signs of that last minute switch being prepared. You start to hear things coming out of the council, stuff like, oh, the Norwich Western Link is very strategic. It will link Great Yarmouth to the Midlands, or it will open up access to Norwich Airport. Those are all the things that ministers like to sort of elevate the planning process to an NSIP process. And we think they're sort of gearing up for that. Okay, I just want to return to the local plan a bit and to say where that fits. Basically, the key message here is that in this local plan, they've distanced the Norwich Western Link from the formal local plan. And that's different to what they did on the NDR, actually. With the NDR, they actually said, oh, the NDR is essential infrastructure. And they banged on about it being essential infrastructure. And it helped their case, because once they got it into the joint core strategy, then when they went to the planning inquiry on the NDR, it was very difficult to argue against it, because they just kept saying to the planning inspector, well, it's in the plan. But the downside of it was Denise and myself and others gave them a very hard time about the NDR being in the JCS. And what they're trying to do now is somehow get the benefit of both of those aspects. So they've actually basically saying that Norwich Western Link isn't in the plan. And if you read this carefully, this is policy for strategic infrastructure, bid on transport. Say blah blah blah, yeah, we're going to have this Cambridge Norwich tech corridor, all this wonderful growth and so on. And then they say this will be achieved by implementation of the Transport for Norwich strategy. And then wonderful sustainable transport, blah blah blah, then delivery of the Norwich Western Link road. So that is basically separating the Norwich Link road out and saying it's not part of the plan, but oh, it would be wonderful to have it. And then later on, the message is basically they're saying to the inspector, oh, the NWL has nothing to do with us, Gov, right? Later on here, they said local transport strategy for Norwich area, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's predicated on this Transport for Norwich strategy. And then Norwich County Council has identified the Norwich Western Link as an infrastructure priority, but critically not essential infrastructure, which is in the plan. So we can fight it in the GNLP process. So I'm trying to avoid using that word fight after things which happened recently in the States. I mean, it's a really bad use of them. We could challenge it in the GNLP process. But to a certain extent, we have to play that, fairly carefully and put the arguments right, because it's not actually part of the plan. So how can we sort of challenge it in the GNLP? So ecological, the habitats regulation assessment. David's going to talk more about that later, but the local plan also has to have a habitats regulation assessment, and we can challenge the Norwich Western Link on its ecological damage, that it should just be taken out completely, no reference of it should be made in the plan. Of course, also the carbon impacts. And also, of course, we challenge the way the plan is entirely growth driven, and sustainable development arguments are based entirely on the sort of growth side of sustainable development, which isn't sustainable at all. But, we're always up against the NPPF and the presumption in favour of development. Just to talk about carbon emissions, this is what's happened in Broadland since 2005. And basically, around about 2005, 250,000 tonnes of CO2 from the transport sector in Broadland. And it actually went down in the back half of the noughties decade. And then when this government came up, so the heat up the economy and all those aspects, across the country, actually, emissions started to go up like this. But in Broadland, in recent years, they've gone up more than national. It's more like that nationally. But in 2018, they opened the NDR, and it went up even more steeply there. And that hasn't actually got the whole of the NDR in it. That's only 3/4 of a year of the NDR, but it knocked the emissions even more steeply. So what you've got is the carbon emissions in the Broadland area rising on a background trend, which is partly a national trend, but partly other stuff they're doing in Broadland, and then with all the road development. And we can only, expect to see, if we get the Norwich Western Link, that going up even more steeply in the future. Here's some numbers. Now, these are probably going to be out of date in a week, because these are out of the option selection report from 2019. But they just give an indication of what we might see. And actually, there's a couple of things which are worth highlighting anyway. So first of all, I'm looking at the vehicle kilometres per year. And even without the scheme, which is this column, you're getting by 2040, you get a 14% increase in vehicle kilometres per year over from 2015, from 2025 over a 15-year period. When you look at option C with the road, you have a 19.5% increase in 15 years. So, oh, sorry, you have a 20% increase in 15 years. We talk about the vehicle kilometres. So what you can see, there's two effects. That first of all, the background traffic is being increased anyway in the Norfolk transport plan. But secondly, that introducing the road is actually inducing further traffic, which is what we always say about roads, they induce traffic. Then when you look at the CO2, you're getting the CO2 going up by nearly 20% over that same 15-year period with option C. Now, the council will say things like electric vehicles and biofuels and so on act against that. But of course, that sort of increase is just totally unacceptable, whatever decrease you might get from some electric vehicles and so on. I just want to finally talk about the cost. This is a very sort of key issue in the current climate. We know that the revenue cost this year has been, well, they've had £7 million in the revenue budget and they've used all of it virtually, and that's for all the things like preparing the planning application, all the consultancy work and so on. And we can expect ongoing revenue budgets of those sort of amounts to keep the project team and their consultants going. But largely what I'm going to talk about is the capital costs, and the just to an interesting comparator is that the NDR at this stage, the equivalent stage where a business case is going to the DfT and before the tender contract, the NDR is estimated at 116.5 million. We don't know what the final capital cost of the NDR is, but in 2019, they said it was more than 2005 million. They're still doing a lot of compulsory purchase stuff on land and paying off people, all sorts of costs still coming in. We can expect it to be something like 250 million. So that's more than double what they said at the same stage. So we expect that the capital cost for the Norwich Western Link will do something like double. Now the council is saying it's 153 million, with 130 million coming from the DfT, and that's what they're bidding with this bid on March the 8th. The expected cost is, we think, is more like something like 300 million, which implies a Norfolk County Council contribution of 170 million. And when you get to 170 million, you then get into very big borrowing by the council. And if you say the 170 million down there where I'm highlighting it, if they borrow at even at a very low interest of 2% for 50 years, which is what they can get as a council, it basically doubles the debt, because that brings in another 170 million of interest to pay off as well as the capital to pay off. So you've then got 340 million to pay off, which is something like £7 million a year for 50 years. And when you add all that up, you get that figure of £800 per household in Norfolk for 50 years for the road. So that's the debt really passed on to future generations. So I want to talk just very briefly about activist and councillor engagement, as this is what the webinar is addressing, and hopefully we'll talk about a lot more about this in the question and answers. But what can councillors and activists do? Well, you can ensure due process on the council. And we're building up a very strong body of legal expertise, and we're really interested in challenging anything on the legal front. And David will talk more about the planning issues on legal later on. But we've sort of done that to a certain extent before. We challenged the NDR when it was at that full business case stage. Now, it was a Pyrrhic victory in the sense we didn't stop the road, but we slowed it down for 3 months and highlighted where they hadn't followed due process, because they actually deceived the councillors when they voted on the full business case in a full council meeting. And we raised the JR against it. Various people here were involved in that, and they backed down and had to rerun the council meeting. So you can get involved in really looking at due process and highlighting where things need to be legally challenged. That's also ongoing at the moment with the Ben Burgess Swainsthorpe case. If you follow me on social media, I've put a bit up on Twitter about that. I was involved early on in helping them get that legal case together and sort of what the council done wrong. And that's going to the High Court next month on similar sort of due process stuff, where the cabinet have overstepped the mark completely on a planning issue. Going into the detail here, but planning issue in South Norfolk. On the council, you can continue lobbying for low carbon transport, and obviously the transport for Norwich strategy is going to be very important earlier in the year. And of course, you can challenge massive ecocidal high carbon infrastructure, and particularly balancing that against cuts in social care budgets, and also, of course, COVID now. The council really is in a very bad financial situation, yet they're still carrying on with this road. It's almost unbelievable. Obtain information. As councillors under the Local Government Act, you actually have the right to see documents, anything which you're asked to make a decision on, or be part of a scrutiny committee, and so on. You can demand to see the documents underlying that. Now, there's various opt-outs, but again, we can try to help with that. You should, you should get more information as a councillor than we can get as members of the public by FOI. That sort of thing helped a lot in the incinerator campaign, actually, that we had a number of councillors, including myself, who were obtaining information and then able to get it out wider in various sort of coded ways. You have to be very, very careful, but we can help make sure that that information can come out the right way, so you're safe in doing that. Scrutiny. Scrutiny is quite important at County Hall, and I'd hope people elected in May can really get involved in bringing in things on, well, everything, but the Norwich Western Link, and getting involved in cross-party work on that. And one thing to note is that the positions on the council, on the Norwich Western Link, are quite malleable at the moment. And after May, we may find some of the, we may find the Lib Dem group are more favourable to largely coming out against the road or coming out against it completely. We can't second guess that, but it looks like, the elections may change the dynamics a bit on that. And that gives the opportunity to work cross-party with basically all the opposition groups then. The Tories will be isolated if that happens, or in terms of support for the road. So just a summary, really, that the main arguments, I think, beyond the legal arguments, are on the ecological, carbon and cost. And each of those arguments is an intergenerational injustice. We're passing on the effect of each of those things to future generations, our children and their grandchildren. It's very important to engage now in the March the 8th business case, what we can do in the next few weeks, the GNLP consultation, hopefully the Ides of March for the GNDP, the Transport for Norwich strategy in the summer, the GNLP public examination coming up this November and December, and also engage on the contract, look for options for scrutiny, and of course the Norwich Western Link planning if it gets to that point, which will be sometime next year. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to unshare my screen, and I'm going to stop recording.